good afternoon. First of all, thank you, all of you, for coming. I greatly appreciate that. And thank you very, very much for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor. It's tremendous to come out. I mean, this is such a completely different environment from what I'm used to working in. And so I'm very excited to be here and to find out all about this place. Before we get started, let me ask you some questions. I'd like to find out a little bit about who you are. So I wrote down some questions. So how many of you are faculty? And how many of you are students? And do we have anybody else who's not faculty or student? Okay. And how many of you, among the students, how many of you are master's students? PhD? Oh wow. How many of you have taught in the K-12 system? Okay. How many of you consider yourselves to be instructional designers? Okay, that's very interesting. How many of you consider yourselves to be learning designers?
Oh, that's a tricky other option.
You can be several of these. You can be several of these. What about interaction designer? Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. All right, good. How many of you consider yourselves to be software designers or developers? A few, okay. Web designers. Flash designer developers. Okay. iOS or mobile developers or designers. Okay. And designers of learning management systems. Okay, all right, that's very interesting for me to get a sense of who you are. What I'm going to do today is begin by talking about my favorite subject, myself. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. I think that's important that you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk to you about learning analytics, and I'm going to mention the Horizon report. And then I'm going to talk to you about some projects that I've been working on, 3 projects. One that's called Avenue DHH, another called Tattoo, and that's not a typo. And then I'm going to talk about learning analytics at Penn State. And in 2 of the cases, I'm going to show you software projects that I've been working on and the types of design that I've been involved in. So I'm going to begin by talking about learning analytics and then show you sort of how these projects that I'm working on fall into the learning analytics camp. All right, so who am I? I wrote this down, but before any of that, I really should have written down that I was originally a K-12 teacher. And my heart and soul are in K-12 education. That's what I'm primarily interested in. Although I'm interested in improving teaching and learning at all levels of education, whether it's in K-12 schools, universities, in formal learning environments, business settings. I'm interested in how you improve those processes. So early in my career, I was particularly interested in learning from the computer. So I had a very strong interest in cooperative learning. I was very interested in how people collaborate when they work in small groups and the types of collaboration that produce effective learning. I did a lot of experimental research designs where I would design a piece of software, I'd split people up into treatment groups, I'd have them work through those groups, and I would compare the results of those experiments. And I was also very interested in applying cognitive learning theory to the design of instruction, and in particular to instruction that would be delivered via the computer. But the problem for me was that, first of all, I had a problem with this learning from the computer. And I think it was all because of Richard Clarke and his argument about technology. And it really started to make me question the value of using technology in education. And I was saying to myself, why am I putting lessons on the computer? What's the point? Is this the best that we can do? And I answered for myself, saying, no, we can do better than this. We can do better than delivering lessons. So what we really ought to be using technology for is to support teaching and learning in the broadest sense. And that will often go a long way beyond just delivering instruction. It may involve the support of lessons that are delivered online, but that really shouldn't be the focus. And everything that I had done was involved around putting these lessons on the computer, getting people to work in cooperative learning groups, and finding out which types of groups learned the content best. And so this was a real problem for me, because it meant that I had to reinvent myself as an instructional designer. And in time, I stopped using the word instructional designer. And the primary reason that I stopped using that term was for me that there was an implication about what it was that I would design, meaning instruction. And I didn't want to design instruction. I wanted to design environments that would support teaching and learning. And that also meant that I had to move away from these experimental designs that I had been following. And so I started to get very interested in design-based research. It meant that I had to retool myself. It meant that I had to learn a lot about programming. And so over the last 25 years, well actually, initially, I didn't spend too much time in programming. Once I got, this was probably mid-90s, I started to realize that I had to start to make my own software. So I spent a lot of time retooling. At that time I also found, I was delighted to find that the federal government was very interested in supporting people who were interested in making different types of software that would support education. So I developed a strong interest in designing tools to support teaching and learning. The first major tool that I designed was something called Avenue ASL. I'm not going to talk about this in any great depth, but this is a system that's used at the University of Minnesota to support the evaluation of the teaching of American Sign Language. It's an online system that allows instructors to assess their students' performance very quickly using online materials. And so I'd been working with the American Sign Language community at the University of Minnesota, and I've been working a lot with special education faculty. And that led me into my latest project that's called Avenue DHH. Avenue stands for Audiovisual Environment. So we've got two audiovisual environments that we're working with here. And ASL was American Sign Language, and DHH stands for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So we were working on a project to support literacy progress for young deaf and hard of hearing children. And my two latest projects, one's called Tattoo, which is short for a test analysis tool, and the third one is about learning analytics at Penn State. So that's where I came from. That's where the sort of steps that phases I moved through, and that sort of indicates where I am now. So learning analytics. How many of you are familiar with learning analytics? Everybody knows a little bit about it. Okay, all right, good. So I was really surprised to find out that what I do falls into the learning analytics field. I had never heard about learning analytics until I started to look at the Horizon Report. The Horizon Report is something that all of you should, if you haven't looked at before, you should. It's a report that comes out annually from EDUCAUSE. And they've been producing a higher ed version of the Horizon Report since 2004. And every year what they do is identify 6 technologies that they think are likely to enter the mainstream soon. And they split it up into 3 different categories. The next 12 months, 2 to 3 years, and 3 to 5 years. And they have 2 technologies within each category. So in 2011, they said in the next 12 months, ebooks and mobile technology are going to be hot. 2 to 3 years would be augmented reality and game-based learning. And then they said in 3 to 5 years, gesture-based computing. And then this thing called learning analytics. And then in 2012, they said mobile apps and tablet computing. And in 2 to 3 years, it was still game-based learning, and learning analytics had moved up. And then they said 3 to 5 years would be gesture-based computing still, and then the Internet of Things that I'm not going to get into right now. But what's important here is that learning analytics, first of all, it turned up on the radar, and then it was on the radar but a little bit closer. So it was on 2 years in a row. So what is learning analytics? Well, you've all seen analytics systems. So on Amazon, you've probably seen something like this. If you go in and you buy books or you look at books, it starts recommending other volumes that you might be interested in. If you watch Netflix, it asks you to fill out lots of forms about movies you like, movies you didn't like, genres you're interested in, and it'll make recommendations to you on movies that the system thinks that you will like. These are recommender systems. What we're interested in is a recommender system for education. Very often people will talk about learning analytics, and they'll talk about data mining, and they'll assume that they're the same thing. They're a little bit different. They're similar, but different. So data mining is really all about computation. And in particular, data mining in education is about developing predictive models. It generally involves taking large data sets and applying techniques to that data set that allow these models to come out that we can use to predict student behavior or student performance. Learning analytics, on the other hand, is about using those models to support teaching and learning. So one is much more data-oriented, and the other is very applied. So how do you do analytics? I'm going to show you a very brief analytics model. This is from a guy named George Siemens, who is very heavily involved in learning analytics from Athabasca University in Canada. And he says that in general what you do is you begin by collecting lots of data from different sources, and then you store those data, and typically what happens is those data get stored in different locations. So then what you have to do is take all of that data that's in different locations, you have to bring it together. And that often involves cleaning the data first. Data have to be cleaned before they can be integrated. So once you've got all the data together in a form where they can talk to each other, then you can begin to analyze the data. Once it's analyzed, then you're going to begin to represent and visualize the data. Yes?
Who's analyzing the data in this context?
Who's analyzing the data? Well, it really... Who's going to analyze the data? So it could be that what's going to happen is the data miners are going to be developing predictive models at this point. So in my mind, when I think about that, I imagine myself working on one of these projects and having this mass of data. I don't want to get my hands too dirty in that data set because it's too detail-oriented. But I do want to work with faculty members from my university, presumably from either information sciences or from computer science, who just love that sort of mess.
But because I was just curious about this because I always thought that the representing and visualizing the data, or creating visualizations for the data, was what was to allow kind of the learner or the teacher or whoever to analyze and make decisions based on the data.
The visualization of the data, I am going to be very involved with, because I'm extremely interested in information visualization in general, and I want to know how we can take data and represent it in forms that end users can understand intuitively.
Right.
The most important part of this analytics model is this part at the bottom. It's helping people to make decisions. So we've got this mass of data, and what we want to do is to help people. I've written 3 things down here. We want to be able to help teachers in particular to intervene when they find that there are learning difficulties that are taking place. We also want to improve self-regulation. And that's self-regulation certainly by students, but it's also self-regulations by teachers. Because this data can be used, first of all, to find out where your students are having problems, and the problem might not be your students. It might be yourself as the instructor. Maybe you're the problem. So it can help people to change the way that they instruct, and it can also help students to find out areas where they are experiencing difficulties, and to help them to regulate their learning behavior. And then the other area is in course evaluation. So I don't know what happens here. I know what happens at my institution. Courses tend not to get evaluated very much. However, I'm aware of a department within the university that teaches a very large number of scientifically oriented content that has a 60% dropout or failure rate. And what is done about that? Typically not very much. These are often considered to be weed-out courses. Many departments even proudly use the term weed-out course. And what types of decisions do analytic systems support? Well, they help you to decide when a student is ready to move on. Usually what we do is we just say if somebody passes a course, then they're ready to move on to the next one. Did you have a question?
I was just really interested in your earlier comment about recommendation systems for education.
Yeah.
And as you talked through George Siemens' ideas here about learning analytics, it seemed to me that there's this underlying heuristic or algorithm for using the data and providing visualizations that are meaningful that lead to data decisions. I was wondering if you're going to talk about those algorithms or heuristics and their importance in this.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm going to no, because that's not an area that I know very much about.
Okay. That's fair. Thank you.
So, in theory, an analytic system should help you to decide whether a student is ready to move on. I don't know why I have question marks here. That's a mistake. Sorry about that. What a student should take next. So again, what we tend to do is we just move students forward in a progression of courses. If we had really accurate information about students and their performance on courses, we'd be in a much better position to help them to say, do you realize that if you consider this course progression, you're likely to drop out? Or do you realize that there may be a different course sequence that you should be following? We can help students to realize when they're falling behind and when they're failing. And we can also use that information to pass on to a counselor. So a counselor can meet with a student and guide them We can also predict students' grade point. So in general, what is analytics for education? There are lots of different definitions. I found this one that I feel pretty comfortable with. Or just more generally, it's using data to support teaching and learning. Very closely related to learning analytics is this area of visual analytics. So visual analytics, sometimes it's called information visualization. And we're starting to see the emergence of InfoVis as a field in education. So what is InfoVis? Well, it deals with the creation of clear, compelling, and convincing representations of data. So, stated a little bit more briefly than that, it's the idea that you can take data and you can represent it visually, and those representations should be intuitive. They should be immediately understandable by the target group. If you haven't seen Many Eyes before, how many of you have seen Many Eyes? Just a couple. Many Eyes is worth looking at. I believe Many Eyes was IBM supported this project. Many Eyes involves the creation of lots of different information visualizations that you can use with your own data. So they create the visualizations, you provide the data set, and it analyzes it for you. And there are loads in here. And they're very, very interesting. You should spend some time.
So do you just upload the data set like in a spreadsheet? Is that what you do?
I believe there are multiple formats.
Huh.
Spreadsheets or XML files. I haven't uploaded a file to it recently, so I don't remember. But I do remember it's very flexible.
Cool.
So what I'm going to show you next are some examples of analytic systems. And I'm going to talk about that very briefly, and then I'm going to show you some of the things I've been working on. So the best known learning analytics system is probably Purdue's Course Signals. There are lots of other ones, so I just did a quick search and came up with these. As University of Maryland, Baltimore County has got one that works with Blackboard. It's called My Course Activity. Austin P has one. There's this Rio Salado Community College that has one that's been very well publicized. And if you do a search, you'll find lots of different analytic systems. And that's because lots of universities are getting very interested in this topic. So let's take a look at Signals. Signals uses a predictive algorithm based on course grades, time on task, and past course performance. And what happens is it splits you into one of three categories. It's really very, very simple. And you're given a risk group. And you're alerted when there are problems that emerge. And the idea is that faculty are going to run the algorithms a number of different times each semester. And each time the algorithm is run, you get a course signal, which is either going to be a red light, a yellow light, or a green light. And that information is going to be shared by two groups of people. One, the instructors, and two, the students. So if I am an instructor, this is what my dashboard might look like. What you can see here is we have a number of demo students. And there are a number of different times that the Signals has been run across the semester. And this is dummy data, but I think you get the point. So you've got these yellow lights, green lights, and red lights that appear. Similarly, if I'm a student, here's a mobile version. So here's a student called Mary Major. Mary's taking 5 different courses. Signals has been run 3 times during the semester, and she's got green lights on everything, except one time on Spanish 310, it came up as a yellow light. Yes?
I have an honest question about this. Would the student already know how they're doing in these classes without this analytic tool? I mean, just based on their own experience, I'm assuming Mary would know Spanish 310 isn't going so well.
You think so? I think that one of the things that happens in undergraduate education is that students get grades on their exams. They move forward through a course, and somehow they never put together the fact that they're not doing particularly well. Or the other thing that happens is they may deep down inside know they're not doing particularly well, but they don't know what to do about it.
Right. So does this help them to know what to do about it?
On their own, not necessarily.
Okay.
But perhaps this, combined with an intervention by the course instructor, is going to result in something.
Okay. What about in courses where there's just a ton of students, like the 300-400 student weeder courses? How can the instructor possibly intervene to make a difference in these students, even if they have the dashboard where all the students are, at different places? These are questions I'm wrestling with.
Yeah.
And
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think what this can do, I mean, if you have a limited amount of time and can only help maybe 5 students in a week, and something like this will tell you which 5 students have the red light, you know which 5 students you need to call into your office and work with. I can see that being really helpful for an instructor to be able to have that kind of thing.
Or even better, if you were able to drill down to specific units in a course, and students went through those units, they could have signals or something that helped them to know which things they should spend more of their time on or less of their time on.
And that's how I think about this. So I see signals, and I think, okay, this is a great first step. And we'll look at some of the results of signals in just a minute. For me, this is saying, there's something interesting going on here. This is a very interesting start. Now, what are the implications for how we move forward for this? What are the types of support mechanisms that we can design into an online environment?
Another way that you could think about it too is from an administrative perspective. Let's say you're a department chair and you have all of these courses being taught in your department. You notice that in this one particular course or this one particular section, you're getting an unusual amount of red or yellow flags, or signals. You could go to the person who's teaching the course and say, "I just noticed this happen. What's going on? Is there something, And that way you may be able to do an early intervention
From the instructor?
with the it may not even be a problem that the instructor caused, but it could be something
There could be some
other
intrinsic
circumstance.
load. I mean, maybe I could see also, once you get this aggregated across semesters with lots of students, you could give maybe previous data sets to a student so they can look at it and go, oh wow, Unit 4 is a killer. That's the one where students struggle. I'm going to make sure I plan enough time for Unit 4 because that's where all the students are struggling right now, and I'm going to prepare myself for that. That must be difficult material,
I think everything depends on the level of granularity at which you're reporting. Inside that yellow dot, there's another array of dots. And within those dots, there's another array of, potentially, depending on what you've decided to look at, what you can measure at.
And this is one of the things that I found, Andy, in some of my research, is that once you have data, those data can be used in multiple ways. You can produce a report, but then the same data can be parceled up in different areas to support the student, to support the faculty member.
How would a system like this collect the data on student effort?
Student effort tends to get described in rather gross manners, meaning like the number of times that you log into a system, the number of times that you download documents, the number of times that emails have been sent. So I think what happens is that the predictive models are going to become more sophisticated over time. So yeah, that effort tracker is presumably highly correlated, but I think that on its own, it's not something that, I don't think you could say to students, if you download more documents from this course, then you're going to do better.
But you do see students, I mean, like anybody who's done distance learning stuff, you know that there are a number of students that do things at the last minute. You can track that if you have, you know, data objects that they're accessing. You can also, like, I mean, like in one of our classes that I teach, we have a lot of short video modules for students to watch. And if somehow you're able to collect data from the system that told you if they're really watching them, if they're just clicking on it and then clicking on the next one, or if they're actually, you know, watching through, that could also be an indicator that would help you as an instructor to intervene with certain students or to help certain students in certain ways.
Kind of one thing I know we use this example a lot, maybe we overuse the example, but I think of Khan Academy, and they have badges on there, and you know, some of the badges are if you pass a unit or whatever, but some of the badges are effort badges where, you know, you participated every day this week, or every day for 10 days in a row, or you were participated for 1 hour, you didn't log out for 1 hour. You were really into the system. And I think I can see that in some of the tech classes that we teach being useful, because if I knew how much time my students were spending on on the tutorial website that we created, and then they come to me and say I'm struggling, I'm like, well, I can see you've only spent 10 minutes looking at tutorials. Maybe that's part of the problem, you know, or you were looking at the wrong tutorials. I could look at that, or you know, something like that.
Another aspect of a system like this is that we're talking out of a metaphor where the teacher is doing something to the learner, and we would like to balance that and maybe tip it the other way, where the learner is responsible for their own learning. So one of the questions you could, you know, Darren, if you were talking about the effort tracker and you were trying to turn things over to the learner, you could have, after every event or experience that they were going to have, if you could have them rate themselves and then have an algorithm in the background. If the student says, why am I not doing well in this course? It could have a little algorithm that said, well, you know, 3 times you've indicated you didn't really think you'd given it your best effort, or that you weren't really interested in this stuff. What could you do to turn it back to the learner? Let's not try to manage everything for them.
That's great.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Do you have any sense for the breakdown on what pieces of this information is system tracked versus human inputted for course signals for Purdue? Do you have an idea, you know, the degree of information that comes from a person actually going in and putting it in the system versus the system collecting it?
I understand that it's all automatic. It's in their course management system.
Just on that same thing, Learning Suite, excuse me, we have a system called Learning Suite that they're putting in. It has a little tracker thing like that, but it's completely based on whether or not the teacher has placed in the assignments when they're due, and then a grade book that says when they've been scored or handed in. And unless that piece of information is placed in there, then the tracker doesn't work. So you have to have that task analysis of all this data that says, well, it could be historically, you look at it and say, here's the predictive algorithm, but then in real time, you have to say, we need to put in these indicators and get that data either from the students or from the system that's set up by the teacher to be able to make that work.
Right, and then processes put in place to sort of ease that transition and or automate
And
it.
visualize it.
So what happens when instructors use signals? Can't be a bad thing. So signals has been in place for just a few years at Purdue, so they haven't gathered that much data, but initially what they're finding is that it's beneficial. It also increases help-seeking behavior. And some systems are claiming that they have tremendous predictive ability, that they can predict within the first week of a course how a student is going to do overall, which is also scary.
It's like, where's your hope for students that they can change?
So how did I fall into analytics? Well, I told you that I'd been working with the American Sign Language program, and I've been working with special education teachers. And when we got to a certain point where we were ready to move on, I sat down with some of the faculty and teachers from special ed, and I said, well, tell me about some other problems that you've got in special education, and let's see if there are some things that we can do, some tools that we can make that would be beneficial. And they started to tell me about what it is that they do in special education. And they talked a lot about something called curriculum-based measures. And the basic idea of CBM is that these are very brief assessments. Sometimes they talk about taking a student's academic temperature. So they're very brief assessments. They take anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes to administer. And they want to administer them regularly. And the reason that they want to do that is because they want to gather data so that when a student's progress starts to fall below what it should be, that there can be some form of intervention. And this is very, very important, in particular in the deaf and hard of hearing community, because many DHH students are mainstreamed in the classroom, and they do fine for a while, and then very soon they drop off the charts. And it's quite common for deaf and hard of hearing students to reach graduation and for them to have 4th or 5th grade reading levels. One of the ways that special education teachers monitor writing performance is to give very regular, brief writing tests. So what they do is they give the students a story starter, and they ask them to write for between 3 and 5 minutes on that story. And then they gather all of the pieces of paper together from their students, and they take them home. And I couldn't believe this when I was told what they do. They grade every single word pair in the story according to some criteria. So they have a list of criteria: correct spelling, correct grammar, etc. So they have a list of criteria, and between every word pair, they either put a mark above the word pair or below the word pair to indicate whether it's correct or incorrect. And then at the end, they add up all of the correct marks and all of the incorrect marks, and they write it down in a grade book. And then they do the same 2 weeks later for each and every one of their students. And they said, is there anything that you can do to help us with this process? And so we began with a piece of software. Oh yeah, just 2 other things. I should just emphasize that this is an extremely time-consuming and tedious task for the teachers. And what tends to happen is that the data go into a grade book, and there they remain, because they just tend to be numbers, and people don't know how to make sense of these numbers over time. And so we came up with a tool called WordMark. And I'm not going to show you the original version of it. I'm just going to show you what WordMark looks like at the moment, although this has been through several iterations. All right, so which one is WordMark? WordMark. Yeah, okay, so here's WordMark. So what we have here is, we have some problems with the display here. And screen resolution, and I ask you just to bear with me. We're supposed to have, in general what happens is we fill the screen with this, but the monitor won't take care of that. So what we have are lots of different assessments that are being completed by a student. And so here's an assessment. Oh, it won't fit on the screen. You're just going to have to imagine that it all fits nicely on the screen and the buttons are all in the right place. So what we did was we designed something where a teacher could go through and they could press 2 buttons, either an up refreshing the screen.
I don't know if you're going to be able to control it through the podium keyboard.
Oh,
Because it doesn't plug in that way.
wrong keyboard. So I can go through this with two buttons. Let's turn the audio off. I can't see the top of the screen, so what I'm going to have to do is miss out the first line. And suddenly you'll start seeing it appear on the second line. Oh dear. All right, it's going through and it's grading the top line at the moment, which we can't see. Okay, so now what happens is we're on the second line that we can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through this and maybe we could play a game of basketball or go bowling. Bowling period is correct. Okay, so period then is wrong because then is misspelled. So I say that's wrong, and then we is wrong. We could go out to eat. I'm going to miss all of those. Okay. All right. So what happens is we go through the system. We go through the essay, and a teacher can grade it very, very quickly, and then all of the data get immediately aggregated as soon as I press the save button, and the information goes into the database and into a visualization system.
I'd like to use this for like grading APA on our papers. And maybe I don't. Maybe that'd be scary.
So we developed this and we put it on CDs. And we made lots and lots of these CDs and we gave them out to teachers. And teachers loved it. And they came back to us. We did an evaluation of it, and they said, well, we really love the software, but the problem is it's delivered on CD. This was done several years ago. What we want is for this to be delivered over the internet so we can compare student data. And what we'd really like you to do is to expand this to some other assessments. So we'd begun this process just with one little piece of software to try to improve the performance for teachers. And then we sat down and we said, well, tell us more about these assessments that you would like us to develop. And this is where Avenue All right, and so this is where Avenue DHH came from. So they said that they had lots of other assessments in addition to this writing assessment that they gave regularly. And they talked about three in particular. One is called a maze test, which is very similar to a closed test for those of you who have worked in literacy. Then there's another one that's called a slash test. There's a third one called real-time reading. And the idea, again, is that what we want to do is monitor young children's literacy progress by developing these very, very brief assessments. It's like I'm going backwards on my slides. I think that I was pressing the wrong key. I'm sorry about that. So as we designed these assessments, we decided that we wanted to go beyond what was done with traditional paper and pencil. And in particular, we wanted to be able to make assessments fun for kids. That was one of our goals from the beginning. We wanted to be able to create interfaces that would be motivating. We also wanted to be able to gather a lot of data from the kids so it would be useful for teachers in order to be able to make decisions on the students. So in our design approach, we focused on 3 different areas: utility, usability, and aesthetics. So utility, what that meant was these had to be highly functional, they had to be very easy to use, and they had to have a strong aesthetic component to them. And then the assessments had to be valid, they had to be reliable, and then they had to be easy to use, visually interesting, and fun. And then the data that we were going to, the assessments should also become learning opportunities. And the data had to be represented in a form that was clear, compelling, and convincing. So we developed a number of prototypes. The first thing that we made was a management system. And the idea of the management system was to be able to control access for teachers and students, and to be able to store all of the data centrally. Because with central organization of the data, we'd be able to put it into a visualization system. We developed WordMark, which I've already shown you. Then we developed the maze, which I'm about to show you. And then we developed Slash, and then we have another one called real-time reading, which measures oral or signed reading ability, which we have on the iPad, and I'm not going to show you that one today. And then we designed an information visualization to display the data. So I'm going to show you Maze and Slash. And Maze and Slash were selected because they're very well established in special education. They're used regularly, they've been validated, so they're highly predictive of reading ability within the special education community. One of the things that was very important for us was to develop a system that would adapt to a large amount of content. So all of the displays that I'm going to show you involve dynamic content presentation. So we've developed algorithms or shells that will take the data and automatically display it on the screen, although I suspect it's not going to be particularly well displayed because of the projection system. There's also a very heavy emphasis on the user experience that I've already mentioned to you. So let me show you Maze and Slash. The first thing that happens when a student comes into the system is that it gets checked. And this is supposed to be displayed in the middle of the screen. It's only supposed to use up a small amount of real estate. I'm going to log in as an instructor. And when I do that, it really isn't displaying properly. It is unfortunate. This is the management system, and what's happened is it's taking this amount of information that's on a typical screen, and it's filling the entire display. So it's just not showing properly. Let's see. Let me log in as a student for a minute so you can see it.
So while he's doing that, is this because our projector is old, Rick?
I'm not sure.
It's the software that readjusts the computers.
Typically what happens is projection systems only have a certain capability in terms of display, in terms of the number of pixels that they will display. The older systems will do fewer pixels.
Usually if you start it with the computer already plugged into it, it'll automatically adjust it for the whole screen. Otherwise it doesn't work as well.
So this is what the student sees. They would see Maze, Slash, or WordMark on here. And here's a Maze test. Oh no, it's not coming to it. Oh dear. Oh, completely lost.
Can you draw on the whiteboard?
Or do you have some screen captures of it, of what it looks like?
Not with me, no. I'll try to take you through. This is blown out also. Can we turn out some lights at the front?
Like
Yeah, it doesn't, it's not showing up. What we have is a number of different levels, and each of the levels is shown by some creature going from a mollusk up to a lion to indicate levels. So this is the students beginning at level 1, and we have 12 different levels that cross 6 different grade levels. So initially a student has to get 3 of these correct.
Could we maybe shrink the size down? Oh, doesn't do it.
Display would work, wouldn't it? Frank, if you went to display, wouldn't it work?
If I was,
Settings, display?
we were messing with that earlier.
Oh, it didn't work.
So, yeah.
No, it's done it in. You know, I wonder if I ought to try doing it on this one here.
Try that computer instead if you log in on the coding computer.
I think otherwise what's happened is that the display of the software is just going to be it'll be impossible. Should we try this, dude? Let's see what happens. Let's get the URL.
By the way, this normally around we're about at the time. This is something we may have to.
Okay, all right. Let's see if this is going to scroll in. I think it froze. Oh, here we go. All right, this is good. This is good. All right, let's see if we can get the maze. Here it is. Good. So here we start, level 3. You can see the different animals that we have. And so we take content out of the database, we pull it in here, and then every 7th word we kick out and we replace with what's called a little maze. And that's where you have these 3 words that you can select from. And one is the correct answer, and 2 of them are distractors selected from different parts of speech. And we have this set up at 12 different levels, 6 levels for 6 different grades, 2 levels per grade. And then we have about 40 passages within each grade level. And each passage has been written at the appropriate reading level for a student. So what happens here is the student has a minute to answer this. She walked to the barn to see them. She saw a big horse in a pen. All right, we're just about out of time. We've got a clock down here, and that will tell us. We can check the score, and we got 3 correct, so we moved on. And this is the game element that we have. So the idea is that we have to fill up this chart in order to be able to move to the next level. So remember, this is an assessment. Normally this would be done on paper and pencil. We're putting it on the computer, we're designing a different type of experience, and we're turning it into a game. Now we have no idea what the impact of this will be. We're about to find out because we're just beginning testing of it this fall with about 100 teachers from around the country. So we have this set up into a number of different levels. Let's get out of this one and let's take a look at the slash test. So the slash test is an assessment that is, again, regularly used in special education. The idea behind this assessment is that you take a passage at the child's reading level and you write the entire passage in capitals. And the student has to go through and they have to put slashes where the word breaks are supposed to be. And again, this is used regularly in special education, and we wanted to be able to create a different type of experience for this. So for the slash test, we have various instructions that I'll skip. So here we're going to start at level 3. If you reach step 6, you'll go up a level. If you go back to step 0, you'll go down a level. And you'll always begin a new level at step 2. So what happens is we get a passage, it comes in here, and instead of just putting a slash in here, we've created a different type of experience. And so we go through, and when we're done, we get feedback. We're told what the possible score is. We scored 4, and so we move backwards. We have a minute to create.
Regressing to seahorse.
So we're regressing, that's right. So what happens is if we get the next one wrong, then we go down a level, and so we're going now from a little fish up to a seahorse.
The value of this being that the teacher will see the score and know what needs work, is that?
Right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the visualization system. So all of this data, so students are going to be taking these assessments regularly, and we hope that they're going to be taking a lot of them because they're designed to be fun. So now what we're going to do is go back into the, we're going to go back into the system. And I'm going to log in.
Those do look like fun. I can see my kids doing those things just because they like them.
So one of the problems that we have with young children is getting them to invest effort into the task. So now what I'm going to do is log in here as the instructor. So this is all dummy data that I have in here. So I'm going to begin with this one here that says select this student. I'm going to click on the little icon, and this will take me into a visualization of each of the assessments, and I'll take a look at the first couple of assessments. So for the maze test, what we now have is a dynamic generation of the student's content. I can't see the bottom of the screen, and so I don't have access to the tools that are supposed to be in here. But what we have is a number of different ways of representing the data. I don't think it's not going to allow me to get to them. I can't get to the tools. Sorry, you're just going to have to believe me. There are various tools that we have below that will show, instead of just showing the student's data, it will show the anticipated performance level, and it will also allow the student to print it all out. Let me get out of the maze and go into the slash test. This is a slightly different way of representing the data. And again, you can see that all these data have been generated over some period of time. This is dummy data, but the idea is to be able to show where the student is making satisfactory performance and when they're starting to fail. But again, I don't have access to the tools because they're lower on the screen. Yes?
So are these visualization things like pre-wedded to the assessments you're using, or could it be used for large classes, certain types of assessments?
These, for now, are very tightly connected to the assessments that they're being measured on. Now, what I'm not quite sure about right now is how much time I have, whether I sort of continue with this.
We're technically out of time. I don't know where you're at in terms of what you wanted to say, but technically at this point we would transition probably over. But tell me where you're at.
Well, I'll see.
And the other room does. Or we can continue the discussion there too. We can throw through some things up on the computer there if we want.
Yeah.
Show some stuff over there, and while we're talking and stuff.
Yeah, well, what I realize is that I've got a whole bunch more content, which I'm not going to show you because I am way over on time. And maybe what we should do is leave this until we take it into the other room, and I can throw it up and we can discuss
Get some
pieces.
soup and talk about it and have
Yeah,
questions and
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. So, you know, I'm very embarrassed that the displays didn't show properly. I should have tested that beforehand, and I apologize for that. But we'll continue the discussion over soup.
Yeah, so let's give him a round of applause. Then we're going to switch over to